Hi, this is Steve Delamarter along with Dr. Ralph Lee, and we'd like to go into the fifth and final video in this series on analyzing data with spreadsheet filters. We found this to be a very exceptionally useful tool for now the fine analysis, getting down, and indeed our two biggest discoveries in the project came through the application of spreadsheet filters. And the focus of this one will be on the new readings of the 17th century. And again, we'll use examples from Ethiopic, Deuteronomy, and Hosea. In the last two videos, we introduced the spreadsheet functionality called filters. We illustrated how we use this functionality to study the phenomena, first of ETH1 minority variance and their fate in the ETH2 period. That was the video from last week. And in this video then, we want to turn to the other discovery to show how we use this same functionality in the same processes, really, to study the new readings of the 17th century. Now, the first thing that has to be said about this part of our work is that we came to this moment of realization that this was going to be really important for us, and yet we knew there was a story someplace that we hadn't gathered data on, and when that moment came, we realized we hadn't seen it to this point, and we didn't see how they were a category unto themselves. We saw them as sort of subsets of other things, and just didn't understand it was clear. And consequently, then, we didn't see the significance. And this ends up being, like I say, the second most significant finding of the project. These two patterns are ubiquitous across the tradition from book to book to book. So this is really, really important.
Okay, so the way we got into this was going back to our data in the form of the text viewer, and we were able to spot a certain digital fingerprint that we associated with new readings of the 17th century. And a good example is one we've looked at before. As you can see, the reading that we see in StanMTR is quite different from all of the ETH1 period, except for a few small exceptions, not important exceptions.
And I might jump in to say, Ralph, that was part of what prevented us from seeing it.
Yes.
Because it wasn't crystal clear. This looked like sort of a mixed thing. But yeah, explain what was going on there.
Yeah. So it turns out that all of the citations in the earlier period are these late copies. We've talked about them before, and they become significant in our story. EMML 2388, EMML 6557 are both late copies. We do include here CAM 1570. We've mentioned before that CAM 1570 is quite an anomaly. So it's a slightly earlier copy, but quite often it behaves, or it has affiliations with later copies. So we're counting it here as a late copy, I suppose.
But once we had seen that and able to understand we could throw those out, then the picture in this, the digital fingerprint of a new reading of the 17th century becomes crystal clear, yeah?
That's right. And we did what we did before with the minority variance, and we built a spreadsheet that compiled all the data. So we harvested that data, we used exactly the same format, and we could not only see the digital fingerprint in individual text parts, but we could see it right across the sample that we'd taken.
Yeah, so let's take a look at that then. Yeah. Here is that data then that was harvested. What do we, just give us an overview of what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so again, just note that most of the EA 1, 2, 3, and 4 are empty. The only location of dots is the ones where the headers marked blue, which are these late copies. So all of these readings are ones that have appeared in the 17th century or later.
And we might notice right at the beginning, man, there's a fairly substantial list of them.
Yeah. 55 altogether, aren't there? And we see as well the phenomenon that we've understood already in StanMTR, that Really, most of the ETH2 manuscripts do the same thing. So most of these are witnessed across the board in SAN-MTR, with a few exceptions.
Yeah.
But the puzzles arise as we look at things like STAN 2 and what's that doing, and what is the participation of these late copies and how they're involved. So the patterns still are complex and still require us to use filters and ways to analyze the data.
What we want to do now then is illustrate this from the book of Hosea.
Yeah.
And so in the book of Hosea, it turns out we're going to have an even larger data set. Go ahead, Dr. Ralph.
Yeah, so our earliest experience of doing this was with Deuteronomy. That has its complexity, but it turns out that things get much more complex in other books. So the illustration we're going to choose is Hosea, where we've got lots of different clusters in the ETH2 period. So as you can see here, just sort of talking through, again, EA1 to 3 are empty. Those are all the earlier manuscripts. EA4 is entirely comprised of late copies, and so they're all together. And in the ETH2 period, you can see that we've got 4 STAN clusters, each with its own type of behavior, and then MTR. And the uniform behavior across the ETH2 tradition that we saw in Deuteronomy is not present.
You can see here in this spreadsheet now we have already introduced the preparatory columns for the use of filters. And we've applied filters in these, and that's what we're going to show here in a little bit, or explore those filters. The exciting thing about it at this moment was that, man, look at that, 132 brand new readings that were not in any of the ETH1 manuscripts. This is a huge category and therefore a significant mechanism for understanding the emergence of the text across time.
Right.
Nevertheless, just looking at this thing, you see it's too complex to instantly see exactly what's going on. The filters are going to help us move. We move sort of from 40,000 feet down to 10,000 feet with this aggregating into this spreadsheet. But then with filters, we're going to be able to go right down and resolve these issues very clearly. Let's do that. So in Deuteronomy, again, there's only one super cluster comprised of STAN MTR, but Hosea, there are 4 STAN clusters, as well as MTR, as well as LAT-V. So how do we get prepared to go into this thing? Well, the first thing that we realize is that we could, in our minds at least, set aside EA4 and LAT-V. Why? Because we knew what EA4 was now. These are late copies of earliest attested text forms. And even though there's dots in here, it doesn't mean that there were readings in the 14th to the 16th century. None of these manuscripts are from the 14th to the 16th century. So this still remains true data for the study of new readings in the 17th century. So we can set aside, though, in our minds, this EA4 column. Also, the LAT-V column we can set aside because we know what that is. We understand what that is. That is a new translation into Ge'ez from the Latin Vulgate, and it usually is 45% different as the columns, quantitatively 45% different than the text of the rest of the tradition. So really what we're trying to understand in then is everything that's left. STAN 1, STAN 2, STAN 3, STAN 4, and MTR. So we begin to take these one by one and use that process where we start with a research question and then formulate filters to help us sharpen the resolution of the data. So let's illustrate that here. Dr. Ralph is in Cambridge. He's going to be pulling the levers behind the filters here. I'm in Portland, Oregon. Our first research question was, where are the places where most of STAN MTR goes the same way? So that is, can we still talk about STAN MTR in the same way that we did in Deuteronomy? Is there evidence to argue for the solidarity of STAN MTR? Ralph, how would we set the filters to find that?
Yeah. So you might remember when we set up these filter columns, we said that there are that our first interest was in clusters. in this case, we're going to use an aggregate column. In this case, it's the one in AZ, where we've added together the sums from stand 1 to 4 and MTR. In that group together, there are a total of 17 manuscripts. So what I'm going to do for this filter is simply look at the cases where 14 up to 17 of the manuscripts of these 5 clusters together cite the new reading. And as you can see, that then takes us down to these 65.
So yeah, you just applied the filters and our list went from 134, whatever it was, 132 down to 65.
Yes.
And how do you, what does that tell you then? How do you interpret that data?
Yeah, it's a good question. So again, the research question is the key. What do we see when most of these manuscripts of these 5 clusters are citing something? And I suppose the most obvious thing to point out here is that stand 4 seems to be standing quite a way aside from the others, isn't it? Yeah. When most of them are doing something, stand 4 is the one that's opting out of this, and the 3 manuscripts of stand 4 seem to be have no dots in quite a few of the cases.
Yeah, and great solidarity in stand 1, 2, 3, 4, and MTR, which is to say, of all of the instances where we gather data on new readings, fully half of them are held in a solidarity of all of the clusters. And consequently, that we think it moves us towards the conclusion that there is a stan MTR, even where this has become slightly more nuanced in the book of Hosea. Yeah, so that leads us then to the next question. What is happening with stand 4? And how can we see it clearly, especially in those places where it shows its variation in the form of minuses? So we go back to our data, we reset the filters, and then we're going to apply a new filter. And what's our filtering strategy to answer that question?
So having spotted that stand 4 often has no dots, a simple filter to explore that better would be to simply select the cases where stand 4 has 0 dots. So I'm going to apply that filter. Sorry, we're about to illustrate that. So as you can see now, that stand 4, the 3 columns have no dots at all in them, and we're seeing what happens in the other manuscripts. Fully 56.
Yeah.
Sorry, Steve.
Yeah, no, that's again, half of the time, almost half of the time, stand 4 just isn't participating in the pool along with the others. So that helps us to see with some clarity this idiosyncratic behavior of stand 4, which can't just have happened, right? It raises a whole other set of questions that we don't know the answers to, but we know that something is going on with stand 4 that's causing it to be different than the other. Finally, then, if we come to ask the research question, how many of the new readings are generally adopted in those late copies of EA text form? So now we're kind of going back to take a look at this sheet tells us that EA4 is participating. Can we quantify that, or can we get a great resolution on the answer? To what degree is EA4 participating in these new readings? Ralph, how would we set the filters for that?
So again, we look at the filters. So we're interested in cases where EA4 cites the variation. So I'm just going to remove 0 from the list in the filters and leave 1, 2, 3, and 4 ticked. Press OK. And there we have the list.
And that list is 58 of the 132 rows, which is, again, coincidentally, just about half of the time. EA4, think about this again. Put your head in the place of what does EA4 represent? This is a group of scribes who are living in the 17th to the 20th century, but are committed to the text form of the 14th to the 16th century. And we see that right exactly in this column. Half of the time, the new readings that arise in the 17th to the 20th centuries are present there in those manuscripts. What else would you say, Dr. Ralph?
It shows that it's a significant partner in the activity. And I think the other thing just to look at here would be the patterns that we see in the rest in the ETH2 period manuscripts as EA4 does cite. In some cases, it's going with the crowd and everybody's doing something. In other cases, EA4 seems to be doing its own thing. And what the story is behind that, I'm not sure we have a full explanation for, but it's an observation that's now begging further research questions.
Yeah, yeah. So a next research question that we had is, what's the place of MTR, modern Textus Receptus? How does it line itself in the tradition? We had some ideas and impressions, but could we use the filtering and the data that we had to give us clear answers about where MTR sits in the tradition? So we wanted to know how frequently MTR innovates in the tradition. Well, how do you translate that research question into a set of choices for filtering? So we figured out a filtering strategy that would show the texts in which the manuscripts of the MTR cluster did something different than the Stan manuscripts.
Right, excellent. So if we look at that spreadsheet, the first thing we want, of course, as we sort of work out a filtering strategy to answer this research question, is we want to look at cases where MTR cites something. Those are the primary ones we're interested in. So all I'm going to do there is click on that list and remove the 0. So now if I press OK now, we're now looking only at cases where MTR does something, and still the pattern looks complicated. So I might then think, okay, Stan 1 is the closest, if you like, to MTR. So let me see how many other cases where MTR does something and Stan 1 doesn't. And that takes the list down to a very short list. We could go one step further and look at the others, but we probably don't need to here, actually, do we, Steve? We can see here we've got 5 cases where MTR does something that Stan 1 doesn't, and then
and none of these are perfect examples, right? The MTR, it's not, with the exception of one, that line in 1108B, that's the only data point where we can argue that MTR does something new in the tradition. And that's so we have to conclude that the majority of the time, vast majority of the time, MTR is simply committed to the standardized text. Yes?
Exactly. Yeah.
So show the filters, and we couldn't find any, and this supports then the conclusion that MTR does not, it was not an innovative step in the textual history, but primarily an affirmation of the standardized text form. So the implications of these findings, wow, the first thing is there's just a whole lot going on in the 17th century. It really is the greatest period of textual transformation of the Old Testament text. And we've been looking at the stats that show that, primarily because there are 2 mechanisms at work, which we have been talking about. We see then in the 17th century, we have these all the scribes are there and they're working away. And eventually, though, we're going to see they fall into multiple clusters because each of the participants each of the scribes is participating in the Weiner pool of new readings with other clusters, but each set of scribes seem to be making their own decisions about which to integrate into their text form. And there are these subgroups that make decisions together. So all of this speaks to a wonderful ferment. There's a pool of variants, and different groups of scribes are coming at it with varying degrees of adoption. In the end, though, nearly half of the new readings of the 17th century are shared by all of the clusters in Stan MTR. So once again, we can speak about a Stan MTR as an entity because there's a deep center to the phenomena, as well as then this interesting variegation that happens around the edges. So this, along with the decisions about which ETH1 minority variants to reject and which to elevate. These are the two primary mechanisms that define the subclusters of the ETH2 period. Indeed, they are the primary mechanisms that tell us the textual history, that have responsibility for the shape of the textual history as it emerges and unfolds from the 17th to the 20th centuries. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah. Okay. So our first reflection is that the work that we've done confirms our working hypothesis about clusters. It gives us explanations as to why those clusters exist.
And as such, then it's going to reflect the dendrograms that we had seen from the beginning and couldn't comprehend what all those differences were. But this now is bringing comprehension to that. Yeah, go ahead.
And what we found is an explanation of what exactly constitutes the various clusters. In other words, why is EA1 different from EA2? Why is STAN1 different from STAN2? The things that we've looked at have given us a full explanation of that. So in this dendrogram for Deuteronomy, EA1 and EA2 are separated by a different set of minority variants. Where EA1 cites something, there's a whole set where EA2 has no citation of them at all, and vice versa.
This is precisely that data where we saw the uniform cluster behavior in EA1, and then we saw the uniform cluster in EA2, that they never overlapped. So
Correct.
This is a reflection of precisely that data. Go ahead, back to you.
Yeah, and then with EA3 and EA4, we see this slightly more distributed behavior that still brings them together in association with each other, but in a rather looser way than EA1 and 2. And then in STAN-MTR, we see this behavior that's right across the cluster. And as we saw, we mostly see that all of the manuscripts of STAN-MTR cite innovations of the 17th century. So, okay,
and now with Hosea.
Yeah. So again, the question is, the ETH1 period looks quite similar. EA1 and EA2 are pulled apart by exactly the same force. We have a set of minority variants that the cluster of EA1 cite that EA2 don't, and vice versa, just as we said before. EA4 in this case are all late copies, and they become part of the story of the ETH2 period.
And they're sharing those readings that are backward influence from the later period, and that's what makes them stand over against the others there. Go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah, and then we have this rather complex set of 4 STAN clusters and MTR, and these pulling apart of these reflects precisely the rather complex patterns that we saw in our filters, where some are cited by 1 or 2 of the clusters and some are not, and different combinations of those. And that's why they are essentially different clusters.
Once again, we just want to commend to your consideration this really potent tool for getting into data, analyzing it at a deeper level, and the filtering capacities in spreadsheets. It takes a little while to figure out how they work, and then to formulate the research question, find out the filtering strategy, apply them, and then analyze the data. And we found waiting for us then all kinds of interesting conclusions that could be drawn. And then we had the data right there to show, to confirm the conclusions that claims we were making. Anything else, Dr. Ralph?
Yeah, I think just to say, maybe with the Deuteronomy data, we could have worked some of this out because it's relatively straightforward. But until we started applying filters, we were bewildered by the Hosea data. And the key thing is the research question, what filtering strategy answers that, and seeing the data. And that allowed us to work these things out. And if we had a much bigger set of data for a much larger book or something like that, we'd be able to do precisely the same using the filters.
Very good. Well, thank you for your time. See you in another video.
Okay.